Alois Irlmaier's predictions of a global conflict are some of the most unsettling aspects of his prophetic visions. He described a war unlike any other, one that would stretch across continents and involved nearly every major world power. According to Irlmaier, this war would be sparked in the East, with tensions between countries escalating to a breaking point. While many of the specifics remain unclear, his predictions suggest a conflict of devastating proportions, one that could result in widespread destruction and change the very course of history. Irlmaier's visions specifically mentioned a large-scale conflict that would begin with a clash between Eastern nations, likely referring to tensions between countries like Russia and China. In his view, this war would not be a conventional one, but rather a modernized, high-tech confrontation that would include nuclear weapons and new forms of warfare. He foresaw entire cities reduced to rubble, mass casualties, and a world plunged into chaos. The war, according to his predictions, would not remain confined to the East, but would quickly spread to Europe, and ultimately, the rest of the world would become embroiled in the conflict. The consequences of such a war, in Irlmaier's eyes, would be dire. Entire nations would be left devastated, both physically and emotionally. It would lead to the collapse of governments, economic destruction, and social upheaval on an unimaginable scale. As the world descends into madness, Irlmaier's visions painted a picture of a divided planet, with borders being redrawn and societies struggling to rebuild amidst the ashes of the old world. Donald Trump's role in these events is a subject of much debate among those who follow Irlmaier's predictions. Irlmaier described a political leader whose actions could trigger or exacerbate the conflict, leading some to speculate that Trump, who has had a tumultuous influence on global politics, might be the one to set off this catastrophic chain of events. While Irlmaier did not specifically name Trump, his description of a strong, often controversial figure with the power to shape international relations seems to fit the profile of the former US president. Trump's political decisions, his America First policy, and his relationships with key world leaders could be seen as fueling tensions that may lead to the very conflict Irlmaier warned about. At 17, Trump influenced many people, who then led the way to the taking of direct action in the middle of the war in China. If the US under Trump were to adopt a more aggressive stance on the world stage, it might trigger the kind of tensions that could escalate into war. The impact of such a leader in Irlmaier's prophetic timeline, combined with the already fragile international relations, suggests that the global conflict he foresaw might be closer than we think. Irlmaier also warned of the internal collapse of America itself, a nation he predicted would face extreme political and social strife. The United States, in his visions, would be a country racked with division, its government unable to address the growing crises that would plague the nation. From economic downturns to civil unrest, Irlmaier saw a country on the brink of collapse. The once mighty global power would be torn apart by infighting, with factions and groups fighting for dominance. This internal chaos could further fuel global instability, and as the US struggles to maintain control, other nations might seize the opportunity to expand their influence, further complicating the geopolitical landscape. In the context of Donald Trump's leadership, many interpret Irlmaier's predictions as a warning of the consequences of a divided America. Trump's leadership was marked by polarization, with deep divisions between political ideologies. His tenure saw the rise of populist movements and significant unrest, both in the US and abroad. For some, Trump represents the type of figure Irlmaier described, someone whose influence could either unite or further divide the country, with unpredictable consequences for both America and the world. The possibility of another Trump presidency, or a leader with similar tendencies, could further ignite the tensions that Irlmaier foresaw, especially in a time when the world seems increasingly fragile. In addition to these concerns, Irlmaier's predictions painted a grim picture of America's future. He spoke of a nation grappling with economic collapse, where the US dollar loses its value and social programs fail to meet the needs of the people. This scenario mirrors the fears of many economists who warn that America's growing debt and economic disparity could soon lead to a financial crisis of unprecedented scale. Irlmaier's vision of a fractured America, consumed by its own internal issues, aligns with the current trajectory of the country, where political polarization and economic inequality are at their highest levels in decades. Irlmaier's prophetic warnings about authoritarian leaders echo a disturbing trend that many observers have noticed in recent years. He spoke of a time when powerful, dictatorial figures would rise to power, ushering in an era of oppression and fear. These leaders, according to his visions, would have a near-total grip on their nations, curbing freedoms and imposing authoritarian rule on their people. The rise of such figures would not be limited to one region or country, but rather a global trend that would spread across the world, leaving millions in the grip of fear and control. Donald Trump, with his unique leadership style and his often controversial approach to governance, is frequently cited as a figure who may fit the description of the authoritarian leaders Irlmaier warned about. While Trump is not a traditional dictator, his populist rhetoric, disdain for traditional political structures, and tendency to bypass established norms and institutions have led some to draw parallels between him and the authoritarian figures Irlmaier envisioned. Irlmaier's wife, Trump's strongman persona, and his flirtations with autocratic rule, such as his refusal to concede the 2020 election, have raised concerns about the future of American democracy and its impact on global stability. However, Trump's leadership was not solely defined by authoritarian tendencies. His presidency was marked by a blend of populism, nationalism, and anti-establishment sentiment, which drew both fervent support and intense criticism. While some saw him as a necessary force for change, others feared that his disregard for democratic norms could set a dangerous precedent. In Irlmaier's vision, this mix of leadership styles could trigger a new wave of authoritarianism, not just in the US, but globally. Irlmaier spoke of a world where the line between democracy and dictatorship became increasingly blurred, as people sought strong leaders to guide them through a tumultuous period in history. For many, the idea of Trump or a leader like him returning to power raises questions about the future of democracy and the potential for authoritarian rule to spread across the world. If these prophecies hold any truth, the rise of such leaders could lead to an era where the rights and freedoms of individuals are stripped away in favor of centralized control. While Irlmaier's predictions were deeply rooted in the historical context of his time, the warnings he issued seem to resonate even more strongly today as the world faces a growing number of political crises, economic challenges, and social tensions. His foresight of authoritarian leaders and a shifting global order speaks to the fragility of the current geopolitical system, where power dynamics are constantly in flux. Whether or not Trump's leadership, or a leader like him, will ultimately contribute to the rise of global authoritarianism remains to be seen. But Irlmaier's visions serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power in the hands of a few. Irlmaier's vision of Europe's future is filled with chilling details about a continent that would be caught in the grips of invasion and collapse. He foresaw a period of intense turmoil for Europe, one where the region would face external threats and internal instability, leading to widespread devastation. According to his predictions, Europe would be overrun by foreign forces in a violent and brutal manner, sparking a collapse of its political and social structures. This invasion, which would happen at the height of geopolitical tensions, would lead to widespread chaos and destruction, leaving much of Europe in ruins. In Irlmaier's view, the invasion of Europe would be orchestrated by powerful Eastern forces, likely referring to Russia, and possibly even China, who would seek to expand their influence in the region. The conflict would begin with sudden and unexpected attacks, catching European countries off guard. The people of Europe would be overwhelmed by the speed and intensity of these assaults. The life of the ears was becoming The invasion would not be a slow build-up of military action, but a rapid and all-encompassing campaign, with entire cities falling under siege and borders being breached in a matter of days. Irlmaier described a Europe left defenseless, as the traditional powers within the region were unable to effectively respond to the invasion. The consequences of this invasion would be far-reaching. Not only would the physical landscape of Europe be scarred by bombs and military action, but the social fabric of the continent would begin to disintegrate. There would be a massive refugee crisis, with millions of people fleeing the conflict zones in search of safety. This migration would put tremendous strain on the infrastructure and resources of other European countries, leading to political infighting and internal tensions. He would be freed to live internal privacy and resort as nations struggled to accommodate the influx of refugees. Resentment and nationalism would rise, further exacerbating the instability. Europe, traditionally seen as a symbol of peace and unity, would be torn apart by divisions and violence, making it impossible for countries to work together to confront the growing threat. The Welsh politician Tom Olker wrote later that Jefferson had to say, "a revolution within 5 years." Irlmaier predicted that, in the aftermath of the invasion, European countries would experience a dramatic shift in their political systems. The governments, weakened by war and internal conflict, would either collapse entirely or be replaced by authoritarian regimes seeking to impose order in the midst of chaos. The European Union, as we know it today, might no longer exist, as the very concept of unity among European nations would have been shattered by years of warfare and mistrust. Instead, Europe could be divided into smaller, more isolated nation-states, each fighting to rebuild and defend their sovereignty. This dramatic restructuring of Europe would likely lead to an era of isolationism, where countries focus on their own survival rather than international cooperation. In the midst of this chaos, Irlmaier's predictions also suggested that Europe's once strong alliances and institutions would be tested to their limits. NATO, for instance, may find itself unable to effectively respond to the crisis, as member states prioritize their own security over collective defense. As European countries struggle to cope with the consequences of the invasion, they might become more inward-looking, abandoning the multilateral approach that has characterized European diplomacy for decades. The disintegration of European unity could have ripple effects worldwide, as the absence of a strong European presence on the global stage would leave a power vacuum that could be filled by other, more aggressive forces. This vision of a war-torn, fragmented Europe is one of the darkest aspects of Irlmaier's predictions, offering a glimpse of a future where the continent becomes a battleground for competing powers. The devastation, both physical and social, would be catastrophic, and the scars of this invasion would likely take generations to heal. For Europe, the future Irlmaier foresees is a tragic one, where a once proud and prosperous region is reduced to ruins, struggling to rebuild in the aftermath of an overwhelming war. Despite the dark outlook for Europe, Irlmaier's prophecies also suggest a glimmer of hope for humanity, a chance for salvation in the face of overwhelming darkness. According to Irlmaier, even in the aftermath of the terrifying events he foresaw, there could be a period of spiritual renewal, offering a final opportunity for mankind to turn away from destruction and find peace. This vision of salvation, however, is complex and far from guaranteed. It is not a simple resolution or a miraculous recovery, but rather a chance for humanity to learn from the devastation and make a collective decision to change the course of the future. Jeremiah chapter 2. Irlmaier described this period of salvation as a time when people would awaken to a higher consciousness. In the midst of suffering and loss, there would be a spiritual awakening that transcends the material and the political. People, having witnessed the horrors of war and division, would turn to faith, seeking redemption and hope in the face of catastrophe. The hand of God, the Holy Spirit, looks down. This awakening would be driven not by external forces or political leaders, but by the people themselves, who would realize that their survival depends not on weapons or power, but on their shared humanity and spiritual growth. However, the path to salvation would not be easy, and Irlmaier's prophecies cautioned that the struggle to overcome the darkness could take time and require immense effort. The world, having suffered the horrors of war, would be left broken and fragmented. The wounds of the past would not easily heal, and the scars of the conflict would remain visible for generations. Genesis 33. Yet, in Irlmaier's vision, humanity would eventually find a way to rebuild, not just the physical structures of civilization, but also the moral and spiritual foundations that had been lost in the rush toward materialism and power. Irlmaier's prophecies also suggest that divine intervention could play a role in this salvation. While humanity may be left to grapple with the consequences of its actions, there is a possibility that a higher power would step in to guide the world toward peace. This intervention would not be a sudden, dramatic event, but rather a quiet, transformative force that would slowly work to restore balance and order. Footnote. Jeremiah, footnote 9. The future, according to Irlmaier, may not be completely hopeless, but it would require a profound shift in the collective consciousness of humanity. Despite this hope for renewal, there are those who view Irlmaier's vision of salvation as an illusion, a fleeting hope that will ultimately be dashed by the overwhelming forces of destruction. Some believe that the world, once plunged into chaos, may never fully recover, and that the events Irlmaier foresaw would lead to the permanent downfall of civilization. According to this interpretation, the spiritual awakening Irlmaier described is nothing more than a brief moment of clarity before the inevitable decline into total collapse. As we approach 2025, the question remains whether Irlmaier's predictions will come to pass. The world today seems to be on the precipice of many of the crises he described: geopolitical tensions, economic instability, and the rise of authoritarian leaders. Whether we are headed toward the nightmare Irlmaier foresaw, or whether we will find a way to avert the worst of these outcomes, remains to be seen. One thing is certain: the future, according to Irlmaier, will not be easy, and the choices humanity makes in the coming years will determine whether we are headed toward destruction or salvation. It was you that brought us together, was it not?